If you stood outside the massive stone fortress of the Bank of England on Threadneedle Street in London on the morning of September 15, 1992, you would have seen a symbol of absolute permanence. For 300 years, the old lady of Threadneedle Street had stood as the guardian of the British economy. It was the rock upon which the British Empire had been built. It had financed wars against Napoleon and Hitler. It had managed the currency that once ruled a quarter of the globe. The pound sterling was more than just money. It was a national identity. It was a symbol of British stability and British pride. But inside the thick stone walls on that grey September morning, panic was beginning to set in. The men in the pinstriped suits who ran the bank knew a secret that the tourists outside did not. They knew that the bank was under attack. They were not being attacked by an army or a navy. They were not being bombed by the Luftwaffe. They were being attacked by a force that was invisible, silent, and infinitely more powerful than any military. They were being attacked by the financial markets. Specifically, they were being hunted by a man named George Soros. George Soros was not a general or a politician. He was a 62-year-old hedge fund manager sitting in an office in a skyscraper in Manhattan 3,000 miles away. He did not command tanks. He commanded money. And on this particular week in 1992, he had decided that the British Empire was bluffing. He had decided that the price of the British pound was a lie. And he was willing to bet 10 billion that he could prove it. This is the story of Black Wednesday. It is the story of the greatest financial raid in history. It is the story of how a single traitor brought the United Kingdom to its knees and forced it to surrender its economic sovereignty. It is the story of the day the 19th century collided with the 20th century and the 20th century won. To understand why a hedge fund manager thought he could break the Bank of England, we have to go back to the political landscape of Europe in the late 1980s. The Cold War was ending. The Berlin Wall had fallen. There was a feeling of immense optimism in the air. The nations of Europe, which had spent centuries fighting each other, decided that the only way to prevent another war was to bind their economies together so tightly that they could never be pulled apart. They created a system called the exchange rate mechanism, or the ERM. The goal of the ERM was to create a zone of monetary stability in Europe. It was a prelude to the euro, the single currency that exists today. The idea was simple. All the currencies of Europe would be tied together. The French franc, the Italian lira, the Spanish peseta, and the British pound would all be pegged to each other. They would move up and down together like a flotilla of ships tied to a single anchor. And that anchor was the German mark. Germany was the economic powerhouse of Europe. Its central bank, the Bundesbank, was legendary for its discipline. The Germans hated inflation. They had been scarred by the hyperinflation of the 1920s when people needed wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread. So the Bundesbank always kept the German mark strong and stable. The other countries of Europe wanted to import that stability. They wanted to borrow Germany's credibility. Britain joined the ERM in October 1990 under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, though she was reluctant. Her successor, John Major, was a true believer. However, he believed that pegging the pound to the German mark would tame the high inflation that had plagued Britain for decades. The British government set the rate at 2.95 German marks to 1 British pound. They promised the world that they would defend this rate at all costs. They said the pound would never drop below 2.77 marks. It was a line in the sand. But there was a problem with the ERM. A fatal flaw that George Soros would eventually exploit. The system assumed that all the countries in Europe would have the same economic needs at the same time. It assumed that what was good for Germany would also be good for Britain. In 1992, that assumption fell apart. While the rest of Europe was celebrating the fall of the Berlin Wall, Germany was paying the bill. The reunification of West and East Germany was incredibly expensive. The German government had to spend billions to rebuild the crumbling infrastructure of the East. To prevent this spending from causing inflation, the German central bank did what it always did. It raised interest rates. High interest rates are like a brake on an economy. They cool things down. For Germany in 1992, high interest rates made perfect sense. But for Britain, high interest rates were a disaster. Britain was not booming like Germany. Britain was in a deep recession. People were losing their jobs. Homeowners were struggling to pay their mortgages. Businesses were going bankrupt. When an economy is in a recession, the central bank usually cuts interest rates to make borrowing cheaper and stimulate growth. Britain needed low interest rates desperately. But because Britain was locked inside the ERM, it could not cut rates. If Britain cut rates, investors would sell the pound and buy the mark to get the higher returns in Germany. The value of the pound would fall. And under the rules of the ERM, the pound was not allowed to fall. So Britain was trapped in a golden cage. To stay in the European club, the British government had to keep interest rates painfully high, forcing its own people to suffer to maintain a currency exchange rate that was totally artificial. The British economy was screaming for relief, but the politicians had tied their own hands. Enter George Soros. Soros was a student of philosophy before he was a student of finance. He had survived the Nazi occupation of Hungary as a boy and had learned early on that authority figures often lie and that systems are often fragile. He developed a theory called reflexivity. In simple terms, reflexivity means that markets are not efficient. Markets are made of people and people make mistakes. Sometimes, the markets believe a story that is false. And when the gap between the story and the reality gets too big, the whole thing collapses. In the summer of 1992, Soros looked at the British pound and he saw a massive gap between reality and the story. The story told by John Major and the Bank of England was that the pound was strong and stable and worth nearly 3 German marks. The reality was that the British economy was collapsing and the only thing holding the pound up was high interest rates that were destroying the country. Soros sat in his office at Quantum Fund with his lead analyst, Stanley Druckenmiller. Druckenmiller was a genius at reading macroeconomic trends. He told Soros that the situation was unsustainable. He said that Britain was like a man holding his breath underwater. He can do it for a while, but eventually he has to come up for air. Eventually, Britain would have to lower interest rates. And when they did, the pound would crash. The beauty of the trade was that it was a one-way bet. If Soros bet against the pound and he was wrong, the worst that could happen was that the British government would keep the pound stable. And he would lose a tiny amount of money on transaction costs. But if he was right and the pound crashed, he would make a fortune. It was a gamble with almost no risk and infinite reward. But Soros was not the only one watching. The entire global financial market was beginning to smell blood. Hedge funds, banks and currency traders all over the world were looking at the ERM and seeing the cracks. The Italian lira was the first to wobble. In early September, the lira came under attack. The Italian central bank spent billions trying to defend it, but failed. The lira was devalued. This was the signal Soros had been waiting for. If Italy could fall, Britain could fall. The trigger came on Tuesday, September 15th. The president of the German Bundesbank, Helmut Schlesinger, gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal and a German newspaper. Schlesinger was a strict disciplinarian. He was tired of supporting weak currencies like the pound and the lira. In the interview, he was careful, but he dropped a hint. He suggested that for the ERM to survive, some currencies might need to be realigned. He didn't say the word pound, but everyone knew what he meant. He was effectively saying that the German central bank would not fight to save the British pound. He was giving the markets permission to attack. When the report of this interview hit the news wires in New York, it was like a starter pistol going off. Stanley Druckenmiller walked into George Soros' office. He said that Schlesinger's comments were the catalyst. He proposed that they should increase their bet against the pound. At the time, they had a position of about 1.5 billion, Druckenmiller suggested, building it up to maybe 3 or 4 billion. Soros looked at him and uttered one of the most famous lines in financial history. He said, "If you are right, then you can't be just a little bit right. You have to go for the jugular." Soros told him to bet everything. He told him to leverage the entire fund. He told him to sell 10 billion worth of sterling. That night, the Quantum Fund went to war. They began calling banks all over the world. They borrowed British pounds from anyone who would lend them. They borrowed from British banks, American banks, and Japanese banks. Then they immediately sold those pounds for German marks. The mechanics of a short sale are important to understand here. Soros was borrowing something he didn't own, selling it at the current high price, waiting for the price to crash, and then planning to buy it back cheaper later to return it to the lender. The difference would be his profit. By the time the sun began to rise over London on the morning of Wednesday, September 16, Soros and the rest of the market had built up a massive tidal wave of sell orders. They were selling pounds faster than anyone could count. Inside the British Treasury, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Norman Lamont, was woken by a phone call. The news was bad. The pound was already slipping in the Asian markets, which had opened hours earlier. The selling was relentless. Lamont was the man responsible for the British economy. He was a smart man, but he was in an impossible position. He drove to the Treasury building in Whitehall. The atmosphere was grim. The officials knew that this day would be the ultimate test. They had a war chest of foreign currency reserves, about 40 billion worth. Their plan was to use this money to buy up the pounds that Soros and the others were selling. They hoped that by buying their own currency, they could keep the price up. It was a strategy that had worked before. Central banks are powerful. They can usually bully the market into submission. But they had never faced a market this big or this aggressive. At 8:30 in the morning, the London markets opened. The Bank of England immediately intervened. The traders at the bank began buying pounds in chunks of hundreds of millions. They shouted buy orders down the phone lines, trying to show strength. Usually, when the Bank of England steps in, the market pauses. Traders get scared. They don't want to fight the government. But on this morning, the market didn't pause. It didn't even blink. For every £1,000,000, the Bank of England bought the hedge funds sold 2 million. Soros was selling. Other hedge funds were selling. Major corporations like Ford and BP, seeing the pound falling, started selling their own cash reserves to protect themselves. It was a stampede. The Bank of England was burning through its reserves at a terrifying rate. Imagine standing on a beach, trying to hold back the tide with a bucket. That is what the bank was doing. They were spending the British taxpayers' money, billions of pounds of it, essentially handing it over to George Soros. By 10 o'clock in the morning, it was clear that intervention wasn't working. The pound was pinned to the floor of the ERM trading band. It was hovering just above 2.77 marks. If it fell below that, Britain would be in violation of the treaty. Norman Lamont and the bank officials held a crisis meeting. They realized they had to escalate. They had to use their biggest weapon, interest rates. If buying the currency didn't work, they had to make the currency more valuable to hold. They had to raise interest rates so high that speculators would be tempted to buy pounds to earn the interest. At 10:30 in the morning, the Bank of England announced a shock interest rate hike. They raised the base rate from 10 to 12. A 2 hike in a single day is almost unheard of. In normal times, it would cause the currency to soar. Lamont hoped this would be the knockout blow that would send Soros running for cover. But the market didn't soar. The market laughed. The traders looked at the rate hike and they didn't see strength. They saw desperation. They saw a government that was panicking. They knew that the British economy was already weak. They knew that homeowners were already screaming about 10 mortgage rates. They knew that raising rates to 12 would cause a political revolution. They knew the government couldn't sustain it for more than a few days. So instead of buying pounds, the market sold even more. They saw the rate hike as the last gasp of a dying animal. The price of the pound barely moved. It stayed stuck at the bottom. George Soros in New York saw the rate hike and smiled. He knew he had won. When a government does something that crazy and the market ignores it, the game is over, he told Druckenmiller to keep selling. Inside Downing Street, Prime Minister John Major was watching his career disintegrate. He was the man who had staked his reputation on the ERM. He had promised the country that the pound would be strong. Now he was watching the wealth of the nation flow out of the door into the pockets of speculators. The phone lines between Downing Street, the Treasury, and the Bank of England were red hot. They were running out of options. They were running out of money. They had spent billions in a few hours. At this point, the British government began to resemble a crew on a sinking ship throwing the furniture overboard to stay afloat. They considered suspending trading. They considered closing the banks. But they knew that would only destroy London's reputation as a financial center. They had one card left to play: the nuclear option. They decided to raise interest rates again. At 2.15 in the afternoon on the same day, the Bank of England announced a second rate hike. They raised the rate from 12 to 15. 15. It was a number that struck terror into the heart of every person in Britain, with a loan or a mortgage. If that rate stuck, it would mean bankruptcy for millions. It was economic suicide. It was a bluff so massive that the government hoped the market would just blink out of sheer shock. But the market was relentless. The traders knew it was a bluff. They knew John Major couldn't keep rates at 15 without his own party throwing him out of office. The sell orders kept coming. The pound kept falling. The game was up. The Bank of England had spent billions. They had raised rates to insane levels. And the pound was still crashing. The might of the British Empire had been pitted against the logic of the free market, and the market had won. As the afternoon wore on, the exhausted officials in the Treasury put down their phones. There was nothing left to do. They couldn't buy any more pounds. They couldn't raise rates any higher. They had to surrender. The decision was made at a meeting in Admiralty House. John Major, Norman Lamont, and the senior ministers gathered in a somber mood. They agreed to suspend Britain's membership in the ERM. They would let the pound float, which meant they would let it crash. At 7:30 in the evening, Norman Lamont walked out of the Treasury to face a battery of cameras. He looked pale and shaken. He read a short statement announcing that Britain was withdrawing from the exchange rate mechanism and that the interest rate hikes had been cancelled. It was a total humiliation. In New York, George Soros and his team stopped trading. They had started the day with a massive short position. As the pound crashed in the days that followed, they bought back the pounds they owed at a much lower price. The difference was their profit. When the dust settled, George Soros had made over $1 billion in a single day. He had single-handedly broken the Bank of England. But the story of Black Wednesday is not just about the money. It is about the shift in power. It was the moment the world realized that governments no longer controlled the financial system. The electronic herd of traders controlled it. This is the end of Part 1. In Part 2, we will go inside the trading rooms to see the minute-by-minute chaos of that day. We will explore the political fallout that destroyed the Conservative Party's reputation for a generation. And we will look at the strange irony that Black Wednesday might have actually been the best thing that ever happened to the British economy. We will see how this disaster kept Britain out of the euro and set the stage for the modern financial world. The battle was over, but the war for the future of Europe had just begun. The sun set on London on the evening of September 16, 1992, but nobody in the financial district went home. The city was buzzing with a chaotic energy that felt more like the aftermath of a revolution than a business day. In the pubs and wine bars of the City of London, traders were celebrating. They were young men in suspenders and shirt sleeves, loud and adrenaline-fueled, drinking champagne. They had just made fortunes. They had bet against their own country's currency, and they had won. But across town in the somber offices of Whitehall, the mood was funereal. The British government had been humiliated on the world stage. The Bank of England, the symbol of imperial stability, had been broken open and looted by a gang of speculators led by a Hungarian philosopher in New York. To understand the sheer scale of the devastation, we have to look at the numbers. In their desperate attempt to save the pound, the Bank of England had spent over £3 billion of taxpayer money. That is not £3 billion of currency exchanged. That is £3 billion of pure loss. It was wealth transferred directly from the British public purse to the bank accounts of George Soros and other hedge fund managers. To put that in perspective, £3 billion in 1992 could have built dozens of hospitals or funded the entire British Army for months. It was gone in a single afternoon. The chaotic scenes inside the trading floors that day have become legendary. Traders described a feeling of unreality. The phones were ringing non-stop with orders from clients shouting, "Sell, sell, sell." The screens that displayed the currency prices were flashing red. Usually, currency moves by fractions of a penny. On Black Wednesday, the pound was dropping by whole pence every few minutes. It was a free fall. One trader at a major British bank recalled shouting at his broker to sell £50 million. The broker shouted back that there were no buyers. Who would buy a falling knife? The only buyer was the Bank of England. The bank was acting as the buyer of last resort, standing alone against a tsunami of selling. The traders could see the bank's orders on their screens, huge round numbers trying to hold the line at 2.77 marks. And they could see those orders being devoured instantly by the market. It was like watching a lion being eaten alive by ants. The most dramatic moments happened inside the political bunker. Prime Minister John Major was physically and emotionally exhausted. He had spent the day fighting a battle he could not win. There are reports that at one point he retreated to his private room and sat in silence, staring at the wall. His chancellor, Norman Lamont, was described as being in a state of shock. He had been forced to raise interest rates to 15, a move he knew was political suicide, only to have to cancel it hours later. He had effectively marched the British troops up the hill and then marched them right back down again while the enemy laughed. The surrender speech that Lamont gave outside the Treasury that evening was one of the most painful moments in British political history. As he stood there, flashes popping in his face, admitting that Britain was leaving the ERM, a heckler from the crowd shouted a question that cut through the noise. He shouted about the wife and children at home who were terrified of the interest rates. Lamont looked like a ghost. He knew that his reputation for economic competence was shredded. But while London was reeling in New York, George Soros was tallying his winnings. The Quantum Fund had made a profit of approximately $1.1 billion. But Soros wasn't the only one. Other famous traders like Paul Tudor Jones and Bruce Kovner also made hundreds of millions. It was the biggest payday in the history of Wall Street. Soros became a celebrity overnight. The press dubbed him the man who broke the Bank of England. He was vilified in the British tabloids. They painted him as a ruthless villain, a foreign predator who had robbed the British people. But Soros was unrepentant. He argued that he had done nothing wrong. He was a market participant. He saw a price that was wrong, and he bet against it. He argued that the fault lay with the British government for trying to defy the laws of economics. He said that if the politicians hadn't been so stubborn, they would have devalued the pound sooner and saved the taxpayers billions. In his view, he had just performed a necessary surgery on a sick patient, even if the surgery was brutal. The aftermath of Black Wednesday rippled through British politics for decades. The Conservative Party, which had always prided itself on being the party of sound money and economic competence, never fully recovered. John Major's authority was destroyed. He limped on as prime minister for a few more years, but he was a dead man walking. In 1997, the Labour Party, led by Tony Blair, won a landslide victory ending 18 years of Conservative rule. The memory of Black Wednesday was a key reason why the voters turned their backs on the Tories. But there is a twist to this story. A strange irony that historians and economists now debate. In the days and weeks after Black Wednesday, the British economy did not collapse. In fact, it boomed. Once Britain was out of the ERM, it was free. It no longer had to keep interest rates artificially high to please the Germans. The government immediately cut interest rates. They fell from the insane 15 down to 6 in a matter of months. This was a massive relief for homeowners and businesses. The lower pound made British exports cheaper around the world. British factories started selling more cars and machinery. The economy began to grow at a rapid pace. This period became known as the Golden Economic Legacy. Many economists now argue that Black Wednesday was actually White Wednesday. They argue that being forced out of the ERM was the best thing that could have happened to Britain. It saved the country from a deepening recession. It proved that trying to chain your economy to another country is a mistake. This realization had a profound effect on the future of Europe. In the late 1990s, when the European nations were preparing to launch the euro, the single currency, Britain stood apart. The trauma of Black Wednesday was still fresh. The British public and the politicians looked at the euro and saw another trap. They remembered what happened when they lost control of their own interest rates. Because of George Soros, Britain decided not to join the euro. While France, Germany, Italy, and Spain gave up their national currencies to use the euro, Britain kept the pound. This decision has shaped the history of the 21st century. If Britain had joined the euro, the Brexit vote in 2016 might never have happened. The UK would have been so deeply integrated into the European economy that leaving would have been impossible. So, in a strange way, George Soros didn't just break a bank. He changed the destiny of a nation. He kept the pound sterling alive by forcing it to crash. The legacy of that day also changed how central banks operate. Before 1992, central bankers believed they were masters of the universe. They thought they could set the price of their currency simply by issuing a decree. Black Wednesday taught them a lesson in humility. It taught them that, in a globalized world, the financial markets have more money than any government. If the market turns against you, you cannot fight it. You have to float with it. Today, the Bank of England operates very differently. It focuses on targeting inflation, not exchange rates. It communicates clearly with the market to avoid surprises. The arrogance of the old days is gone, replaced by a cautious respect for the power of the invisible hand. George Soros went on to become a major philanthropist, spending billions of his dollars to promote democracy and open societies around the world. But he remains a controversial figure. To some, he's a brilliant investor who exposed the incompetence of politicians. To others, he's a dangerous speculator who destabilized a country for profit. But regardless of how you view him, the events of September 16, 1992 stand as a turning point in history. It was the day the financial markets declared their independence from the state. It was the day the electronic herd trampled the old guard. As we look back at the footage of that chaotic day, at the sweating politicians and the shouting traders, we are seeing the birth of the modern world. A world where money moves at the speed of light, where national borders are porous, and where a single man with a computer and a conviction can challenge an empire and win. The Bank of England still stands on Threadneedle Street. Its walls are still thick. Its vaults are still deep. But the aura of invincibility is gone. It was shattered on a Wednesday in September by a bet that changed the world. And the ghost of that day still haunts the corridors of power, reminding every chancellor and every prime minister that the market is always watching, and the market is never wrong for long. The imperial pound died that day, not with a bang, but with a phone call from a trader selling 10 billion units of a dream that was no longer true. And in its place rose a new reality, cold hard and ruled by the numbers. This is John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.